Hey guys, welcome to this week's episode of Recovery Talk. So, this week I'm going to talk about so-called food addiction and essentially this narrative that we often hear in certain areas of psychology that you can be addicted to food and use food in the same way that people are using, let's say, drugs and alcohol. Essentially, the addiction model applied to food. And I'm going to talk a bit about why I don't necessarily think that this approach is helpful for people who feel like they suffer with so-called food addiction. And I also want to question the whole thing about food addiction in general. Can you be addicted to food? Also, aren't we all addicted to food? So essentially, my aim of this episode is to debunk a lot of views people have on quote-unquote food addiction. I use this term very loosely because it's a term I don't quite like. I'll explain a bit more why later. And also try and answer the question, can people be addicted to food in the same way that someone is addicted to, let's say, gambling or alcohol or drugs, etc., etc.? So first of all, if you hear some snoring in the background, that is my lovely dog who is deep asleep on the couch right now. So just to recap, because I realized I didn't really explain or talk much about this situation, but some of you may know that a few months ago I had a rescue dog on home trial. Hadn't actually formally adopted a dog. It was on a home trial to check if it was suitable to live in a home, because this dog had never been living in a home before. It essentially has just been living in a cage for the last 5 years. And I wanted to give the dog a chance, see how it would settle in. And it was such a lovely dog. But unfortunately, it turned out that the dog suffered certain issues that made it unsafe and unsuitable to live in a home environment, at least in my home environment. And yeah, what happened is that this dog turned out to suffer from some issues that we weren't aware of. It turned out to suffer from quite significant sleep aggression, which is essentially a dog being aggressive when it's woken up from sleep, right? And also suffering resource guarding, so quite significant guarding of resources. And these issues sometimes can be worked on, but the problem with this particular dog is that it will go straight to attack, right? So it bit me twice. One was actually right under my eye. If it had bitten me, I guess, a centimeter higher up, I could have lost my eye. So that was pretty dramatic. I was like bleeding from my face. Very scary. And then the second time it jumped up and bit my arm. And it was pretty bad. I needed to go and get it checked at the doctors, and I needed I don't know what you call it, the injections that they give you with dog bites, because it pierced my skin quite bad. I still have scarring from it. My arm actually went completely yellow. Really scary. And it was really difficult because dogs have always been like my safe space. You know, I'm grown up around dogs. I'm very dog experienced. I've grown up having this massive Rhodesian Ridgeback sleeping in my bed. You know, I always felt so safe around dogs. And this dog would kind of bite unprovoked. There wasn't that much warning. It would just kind of go straight to it. And I was kind of walking on eggshells in my own home. And it was very, very scary, you know, and I really cared for the dog. But it was a very risky situation, because one thing is biting me, but also what if it starts biting a child? I could get in serious legal trouble. You know, if you have a dog that's knowingly out of control and it bites a child, that can put you in jail for years, right? It was just very, very dangerous and scary situation. And after that, I was just kind of just put off by the idea of having a dog in general, because I was almost, I hate saying the word traumatized, but it was scary, you know, I didn't feel safe. But eventually I realized that I do really want to give a dog a chance. You know, not all dogs are like that. And it was not a bad dog, you know, it was a traumatized dog. We never know what a dog might have been through, right? And this dog, they concluded they'd probably been abused quite badly. And it was overall just a heartbreaking situation. And that's why I didn't want to really talk about it, because it was difficult. I was still processing it. But still, I'm glad that, you know, the dog got a fair chance, you know, and many dogs don't get that chance. So yeah, anyways, I eventually, after some time, healing, mentally and physically, I decided that I did want to give another dog a chance. So I went to the shelter, and then eventually I met a senior dog called Crystal, 10 years old, covered in scars from surgeries. I felt so bad for her. And I was just thinking, yeah, you are going home with me. And she did, after some more surgeries and some more rest at the shelter, because she was still in need for some more stuff done. So yeah, now I'm here with this giant dog in my home. She is massive. I always tell people before they meet her, like, just letting you know, my dog is really big. And then like, okay. And they meet her and then I was like, oh my God, she's massive. She's massive. Yeah, she is probably going to cost me a freaking fortune because a lot of her issues aren't covered by insurance because they're pre-existing and she's so old. I don't know how much time she has left, you know. She's going to break my heart. She's going to break my bank, but I just could not help but take her home, and we are best friends, and she's the most gentle dog. Anyways, guys, story over. Let's get into it. I guess moral of the story is you never know what people or dogs have been through, but it still could be worth giving things a second chance. Anyways, guys, that was enough dog talk for now. Let's start talking about the actual topic of today's episode, which is food addiction. And is food addiction really a thing? So to answer that, is food addiction a thing? I think first we can kind of just acknowledge that, I mean, yeah, to some extent it is a thing because we all are addicted to food. We all need food to survive, right? In the same way that is sleep addiction a thing? Yeah, we all need sleep to function, right? We all need to drink water to function. We all have certain biological needs that we are addicted to as human beings, right? So in that sense, we all are food addicted. But of course, when we discuss food addiction and talking about, you know, the concept of addiction and how this ties into food, of course, we are not talking about the fact that us human beings need to eat to stay alive. Instead, we are talking about, you know, in the same way that we talk about alcohol addiction or gambling addiction or drug addiction, right? And that food is somehow the, I guess, substance that is being used in an addictive way. And this is where it gets more controversial. And there are many, many interpretations, thoughts, feelings, experiences surrounding this, right? So I will say that this is just my perspective based on my research, based on working with people who consider themselves somehow food addicted. Again, this is my take, and you may have a different take, or you may find another take that you feel resonates more with you. That is completely fine. But I wanted to share my thoughts and experience as well, working with people who claim to feel food addicted, and also myself having recovered from what felt like at the point food addiction. I want to start off with explaining why I don't think food fits into the addiction model in the same way as drugs and alcohol. And here's why. With alcohol, for example, the substance in itself and access to the substance is the problem, right? If you abstain from alcohol, if you stay away from alcohol, that, you know, removes that substance and therefore remove the problem. I know that was like a super simplified explanation of alcoholism, and of course understand it's not that simple. I understand still people have cravings, they still can miss their addiction, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, the solution would, at least most traditional approaches to alcoholism, the solution would be abstinence from alcohol and actually staying away from alcohol. And then when someone has access to alcohol, this creates problems. And the same here would go with a lot of other things, such as gambling. You know, the solution to gambling will tend to just be staying away from gambling. Again, super simplified. Same things with drugs as well, you know, staying away from drugs. And I understand, of course, also with drugs and alcohol, there is the biological component that someone develops a physical addiction as well, right? So gradually weaning someone off drugs or alcohol could also be, you know, a solution here. But at the end of the day, when it comes to, for instance, drugs and alcohol, we can acknowledge that the drug itself, the alcohol itself, is part of the problem and something that needs to be abstained from. And that doesn't mean that that is just a problem. Of course, often there are underlying issues as why someone turns to this, right? So why do I not believe that the same thing goes with food addiction, right? The reason for this is that what I've seen over and over is that with so-called food addiction, or call it binging, emotional eating, whatsoever, actually having unlimited access to the substance, which in this case is food, tends to ease the so-called food addiction. This is a big paradox because we know that if an alcoholic is just left with unlimited constant access to alcohol, their alcoholism is probably going to get worse, right? But with food addiction, what I see over and over is that having unlimited, unrestricted access to food, no banning yourself from certain types of food, certain amounts, no restriction, tends to actually ease the feelings of feeling addicted around food. And understand that there exist cases where someone may, for instance, binge eat or struggle with what feels like emotional eating, food addiction whatsoever, without there being any component of restriction involved. This exists. It's far more rare. I still don't think I've really have worked with someone who's experiences that, but I know that they exist. But even for this group of people, further restriction tends to make just the food addiction worse, right? And this is just a biological truth, because what we see is when someone is restricting their food intake and they are undernourished, right? And I think very often when I mention undernourished, someone is imagining someone who doesn't eat at all. Someone who's just completely stopped eating. This is not what I mean. I mean someone who's eating less than they need. So taking in less energy than what is needed to maintain their basic day-to-day body function, right? So they are in an energy deficit. What happens when someone is in an energy deficit, especially if it's severe energy deficit, but it can be a light energy deficit as well, is that certain hormones that are regulating appetite, metabolism, weight, they start going a little bit out of whack. And essentially what happens is that the body is detecting, okay, food resources are scarce, so we need to hyper focus on food, and essentially the reward centers in the brain that rewards you for eating goes up. So if you're someone who is been restricting, right, whether you are someone with a restrictive eating disorder, whether you're someone who's on a diet, and what tends to happen is that you'll notice mentally you will start hyper focusing on food, right? And when you are eating, the reward centers of your brain, you're going to get a bigger reward compared to someone who wasn't restricted. It makes perfect sense, you know, if I am absolutely sleep deprived and super tired, haven't slept well for a few days, and I'm maybe out on some event or something, I will just be thinking, oh my God, I can't wait to come home. And when I'm finally at home in my warm bed, I'm going to be so happy and be like, oh, this is wonderful. If you did a brain scan of me, you would see the reward centers of my brain will light up compared to the days where I just go to sleep as normal. It's just habit, it's just routine, it's nice, but it's not like, oh my God, finally, right? This is just basic neurology, you know? This is not something I'm making up as some kind of psychobabble. You can literally know that when you've been deprived of an essential need and you get it, the reward centers of your brain is going to go up. And for example, in the same way, when I'm very sleep deprived and imagine I'm at an event, I'm going to I can call it sleep searching behaviors. I'm going to search for opportunities to get home and go sleep, right? Also, same thing. I'm dehydrated. I'm thirsty. I will engage in water-seeking behaviors. I will try and find somewhere where I can get a glass of water, right? And when I drink that water because I'm really thirsty, the reward centers of my brain is going to light up. And I think the fact that the reward centers light up in the same way that also when someone is, you know, doing drugs, it light up certain reward centers in their brains, right? When an alcoholic finally gets that glass of wine, reward centers go up because they're being rewarded for the behavior. And I think the fact that people can notice this reward from food, especially when restricted, can make people think, well, this just shows that food is addictive. But by that logic, pretty much anything would be addictive. There's so many things that reward our brain. You know, we also get brain rewards in certain regions in our brain lighting up when we are spending time with someone we love, get a hug, get a kiss from someone we have a crush on, you know? Does that mean we are addicted to other people? Again, you can see it pathologizes a lot of normal human behaviors. Us humans, we are meant to seek company, support, love from other people, and we also are meant to seek out food to keep ourselves going. It's a basic need of survival to seek out the things we are biologically primed to need, right? But things such as alcohol and drugs, it gets destructive because we don't need alcohol and drugs to live, right? And it is toxic substances. I mean, you can always debate, you know, are all drugs bad? Should drugs be legal? I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole because that's a completely different episode. But those who know me know that I personally don't enjoy drugs or alcohol, but I'm very much in favor of decriminalization, and I don't want people who are using various substances struggling with addiction to be stigmatized, and I think criminalizing it is just making a lot of things worse, even though I'm not personally interested in drinking or doing drugs. I'll have a glass of wine now and then, but nothing more than that. And that is the thing, right? I'm someone who doesn't really drink or do drugs, and I can live without it. But you can't be someone who lives without food, right? You can't be someone who lives without sleep, without drinking fluids like water, you know? You can't be someone who lives without any form of human connection. I mean, some can, but it's not really what we are primed. We're not primed to just live alone without any kind of human support or connection, right? So it is just from an evolutionary point of view, these are basic needs. Drugs and alcohol are not. And we know that drugs and alcohol can be physically very harmful. You know, for example, that alcoholism is very, very harmful for the body, right? And we know that many drugs as well, if you're consistently using a lot of drugs, that can have harm on your body. Food, on the other hand, is something we just need. And I know some will jump in and say, oh yeah, but what about certain foods? Aren't certain foods addictive? Aren't certain foods dangerous? But here's the truth, right? So let's use sugar as an example. Sugar is a good example of a specific food that's been labeled as being addictive. It lights up the brain as in the same way as cocaine, blah, blah, all of these crazy ideas about sugar just somehow being the devil. Did you know that you could see addictive-like behaviors in rats around sugar, but only in the rats who've been deprived of it, right? Energy-deprived rats or sugar-deprived rats would show this food-seeking behavior and addictive behaviors around sugar. So can you see here that taking away the sugar is actually creating more addictive behaviors around sugar? And this is very different from alcohol. You know, I'm someone who doesn't drink, but my lack of drinking, okay, I drink sometimes, again, a few glasses of wine now and then, but overall, I'm someone who is not really drinking much. That doesn't create addictive behaviors around drinking for me, right? If anything, it just makes me not really enjoy drinking that much, you know, because it's just not something I like. So me being, I guess you can use the word deprived from alcohol, doesn't make me go on a drinking binge as soon as I can access it. Maybe that's the case for some people who are, I guess, not drinking because they have a lot of shame and guilt and forbidden fruits taste the sweetest, and then when they're finally allowed to drink or sneak out to drink, it will be more exciting. I mean, we could always go there, but as an adult person who can technically go drink whenever I want to, but I just don't do it because I just don't feel like it, right? And also because my dysautonomia does not agree with alcohol, I will just faint on the floor. So anyways, the entire point I'm trying to make is that abstinence from alcohol doesn't necessarily create more alcohol-seeking behaviors, nor does it mean that when you have access to alcohol, you'll necessarily binge drink. That's not necessarily the case. Same thing goes with drugs. Abstaining from drugs doesn't mean that you will just continuously thinking and obsessing about drugs and seeking out more drugs, and when you are in a room with drugs, you're going to go on a crazy drug binge, right? And that is so different to food addiction, right? Because, oh my God, time and time again, the people that I see and work with who are, you know, self-proclaimed food addicts, binge eaters, emotional eaters, pretty much every single one of them, actually, you know what? Every single one of them so far that I work with, you know, they are engaging or have engaged in some form of restrictive behavior around food. And they did not experience this so-called food addiction before the restriction kicked in. These people will usually say that they were intuitive eaters who were perfectly able to be normal and sane around food until the restriction entered the picture. And then they feel like food became a coping mechanism. They noticed that they turned to it when they were sad. And yeah, that makes sense because you're undernourished, so your brain's reward center will light up extra from food, right? And if you're sad, you're going to seek out rewards. But if you were not undernourished, you wouldn't get that same hit from food, right? I said it before, but I was talking to someone that was recovered from bulimia, right? And they said that they tried to binge when they were recovered because that was something that used to give them that reward, that kick, that comfort. And they would tell me, you know what, it just doesn't hit the same. You know, it doesn't hit the same. Because I'm renourished, that person was renourished, so their brain didn't give them the same reward from binging as it would when they were undernourished, right? So it didn't hit the same. They tried to engage in the behavior because it used to be something that gave them reward, but they noticed that, again, it doesn't give them the same reward because their brain isn't primed to reward them for that behavior anymore. And that person, in order to get to that point, they had to go through a period of eating everything in sight, engaging in that, letting themselves eat, engaging in that extreme hunger. And that is how they came to a point where they ironically stopped binging. So essentially, they had to go on a food binge to stop binging. That is very different from alcoholism. You don't tell alcoholics, oh yeah, go on a drinking binge, drink it out, just get it out of your system, and then you will probably feel like stop drinking. That is not how it works with drugs and alcohol, but that is, in many, many cases, how it works with food. At least in cases where the quote-unquote food addiction can be traced back to some kind of restrictive behaviors, whether that's an eating disorder or whether it is just some form of restrictive behavior, some form of yo-yo dieting. Often with so-called food addicts, you can see, when you trace back, you can see that they maybe grew up around a parent that was restricting and instilled a lot of shame around certain foods. Maybe they were in a household where certain foods weren't allowed. Maybe they've seen this behavior around them and picked up on it that way. Or maybe just from growing up in diet culture, even if you had a home that was sane around food, you maybe see certain ideas around you in diet culture about certain foods being bad, certain foods, you shouldn't eat them, you shouldn't have access to them, and this worsens the behavior. And then I'm sure there are cases where someone is just eating and eating and eating that never had any element of restriction and never tried to, intervene with the behavior. It's just been non-stop extreme hunger from birth. I'm sure these cases exist, and I know it can be a possibility in certain metabolic conditions, but overall that is the more rare cases. And even in these cases, excessive restriction is not the solution. Even in cases of classical binge eating disorder with no restriction to be traced, no restrictive elements, which again is more rare, the solution is not more restriction. The solution is not to demonize entire food groups and putting them on a pedestal. Instead, the solution seems often to be to just have access to a variety of foods, allow yourself to eat a bit of everything, right? And in eating disorder recovery, very often you need to go through a phase of rebellion where you're eating more than a little bit of everything. It will be a lot of the forbidden foods and less so of the foods you've been allowing yourself to eat, right? It's completely normal. I want to remind you that just because something feels addictive doesn't necessarily mean that it is. But at the end of the day, we could also argue that I guess us humans are addicted to food because we need it to survive, right? So by that logic, yeah, we are all food addicts in the same way that we are sleep addicts. Just because something feels emotional, just because something gives you a reward, doesn't necessarily mean that it is to be pathologized, right? And I think that very often the mistake people do when it comes to so-called quote-unquote food addiction is that they see food as the problem instead of part of the solution. Because with drugs and alcohol, that's what you're doing. You see the alcohol, you see the drug, these are problems, these needs to be taken away, right? But with food addiction, you often see that trying to take away the substance, which in this case would be food, actually just worsens the problem. And instead giving someone access to the so-called substance is easing the problem, right? And also just again, back to neurology, you see someone who is, as I mentioned, someone who is, restricted, undernourished, they have certain hormones, who are regulating food seeking behavior, food obsession, hunger, metabolism, appetite, all of these things, these will be out of whack. And if you see someone then renourishing, being refed, being at the set point weight range, eating a sufficient amount, you see these hormones normalize. So from a biological point of view, so-called food addiction eases with refeeding and being energy balanced, or a time period of energy surplus, which is also often necessary in recovery. And I often hear people who've spent like years and years in therapy trying to figure out, why am I so-called emotional eating? What is going on with me? I must be feeling some kind of void inside. And then you see, and they're actually goddamn hungry. They're food restricted. Their leptin and ghrelin levels are out of whack. It's like, of course you're hungry. That is a little bit like me always restricting my sleep and then wondering why I'm feeling so tired all the time. Maybe I'm trying to sleep away my life, No, maybe I'm actually tired, need to sleep more, need to give myself more rest. And then my urges to always go to bed probably will go away. Sometimes the solution may be a lot more simple than you think, right? For sure, when I was struggling with, binge purge anorexia, I 100% felt like I was food addicted and emotionally eating, because when I was engaging in my binge sessions, right, it felt like I was in a haze. It felt like I was on autopilot. It felt like I was out of control. I couldn't stop it. It didn't feel like, oh, yummy, I'm going to have some food. It felt like I'm in this insane stage where it's like I'm not myself. I'm like possessed by something external. It felt like an addiction, 100% felt like an addiction. And especially the fact that I would be more likely to engage in binge purge sessions when I had a bad day. That just reinforced my idea that this is 100% addiction, it's emotional, and the food is the problem here. I'm using the food to fill some kind of void. And you know what? The void was hunger, right? Yes, I was upset, and I had difficulties, and I felt like food gave me a reward. But the reason why food gave me a reward was because I was hungry. And that's why now, as someone who is fully recovered, if I'm having a bad day, I don't think I'm going to run to the grocery store, buy a bunch of binge foods and eat 20,000 calories in a sitting. That is just not something that comes in my head. I could do it, but it wouldn't give me much reward. Yes, I will say that sometimes when I'm upset, for instance, last night I was just like in a bit of a bad mood. I decided, I'm going to buy myself something nice from the shop. So I went and I got myself these like, have you ever tried those M&Ms, like brownie M&Ms? Oh, they have them at my corner shop. Brownie M&Ms, they also have like salted caramel M&Ms. They're amazing. Anyway, so I went and got myself that because I was like, you know what? I'm having a bit of a bad night. Let me cheer myself up, get myself something nice, put on a documentary. That is not food addiction, right? Any kind of eating that isn't done due to a physical growling in the stomach isn't emotional eating or food addiction or, whatsoever. Hunger and appetite is so much more than just physical cues. We eat for other reasons than that. Sometimes I choose my food based on convenience, what is accessible, what is around, or it could be something as nice as like, you know what, I need some comfort. I'm gonna get some chocolate. That is not necessarily a problem to be solved. It is actually just being a normal human being. We turn to things that gives us happiness and comfort and joy in other cases, right? For example, when you're having a bad day, you might call up a friend. Does that mean that you're like codependent? You're addicted to other people? No, it's just you doing something nice for yourself, right? And I understand the complexity of someone's only coping mechanism is food, blah, blah, blah. But again, I see this usually in people who are restricted. And I think emotional eating is just so heavily demonized when actually, you know what, really the world is the world is at its end stage, and you having some ice cream because you're upset, is that really a bad thing? Like, why can't we cheer ourselves up with food, right? Doesn't necessarily mean that we are addicted to food or emotional eaters, right? I honestly think why this behavior is pathologized so much compared to a lot of other behaviors is just because we live in such a diet culture influenced society, right? Because so many other things we're doing to cheer ourselves up is not demonized, right? If anything, it's the opposite. If someone is like, I'm going to go for a walk to cheer myself up, then that is seen as like, oh, amazing, great, good, amazing. Even though that can also be disordered in some cases, right? And if I were to pathologize myself going to the corner shop and buying those delicious M&Ms, having some nice time and eating them, enjoying, I think if I were to like deny myself from doing that, it would probably just have been, I would have made it a bigger deal in my head. So then when I had a bad day, I'll be like making it some dramatic thing, going and buying maybe 10 bags instead of one, right? Because it's like, this is my one chance to eat it. Instead, I got that bag of M&Ms. I had most of them last night, and then I woke up, actually had some of them with my morning decaf. I didn't overthink it. I didn't pathologize it. I just allowed myself to have it, right? And I'm here, I'm alive, nothing bad happened. So maybe this can be an invite to kind of look a bit at what kind of, I guess, coping mechanisms or things to do to cheer yourself up are you pathologizing, and are they really as toxic as you seem? If you are someone who constantly find yourself turning to food for that reward, I think it's also important to ask yourself, are you eating enough, right? And I'm not talking about going to the shop, grabbing an ice cream to, enjoy when you're having a bad day or a good day, or just eating ice cream in general, eating in general. Like, we all are allowed to enjoy tasty foods. That is not something toxic. But if you're someone who, for instance, like I used to do, turn to like binge purge sessions, it could be worth asking yourself, am I eating enough? Why is my brain rewarding me so much for this? We're talking not just the little comfort reward that I get, again, from getting the chocolate, watching a documentary that, oh, this is nice. It's kind of similar to the comfort you get from having a nice shower, having a nice candle burning. It's more like comfort, self-care. That is a very different type of reward compared to the reward someone will get for a binge purge session when they're undernourished. If you experienced it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. These are different rewards. So if you are someone who feel like you are so-called addicted to food, especially addicted around certain foods, are these foods that you're banning yourself from? Are you eating enough? Have you always had these tendencies around food? Have you always been someone who feel out of control addicted around food? And, even if you have, could it be that you in your childhood, were you kind of growing up around parents who would restrict certain foods, ban foods from you? When I was little, I grew up in a home where there was very little sweets around. It's not like my parents were restrictive or anything. They just did not eat much sweets, and I loved sweets. So whenever there was sweets available, I would eat a lot more than I probably would have if it was available all the time. And I always used this as like a proof that I was, the unicorn who was actually addicted to sugar, because as a kid, I would have such a big sweet tooth and there wasn't much sugary sweet foods around, and I would just eat if there was sugar or sweets around. But then now in adult age, I see that I have all foods available, and I kind of, sometimes I want something sweet, sometimes I want something savory, right? So again, maybe you just need to allow yourself to eat, right? Maybe you need to allow yourself unrestricted access to food, to allow your body to find its natural set point weight range, to stop the yo-yo dieting or restriction or whatever behaviors you're engaging in, to quit the food rules, to quit that good versus bad food binary, to actually allow yourself to have that chocolate cereal for breakfast that you've been banning yourself from and then hyper focusing on and then binging on and being like, oh my God, this just shows that this cereal is the demon. I'm addicted to it. I need to never have it in the house. Maybe you should have it in the house more, right? If binging, if sitting down and eating thousands of calories in a go is something that you find rewarding in your brain, it gives you reward, then chances are you are undernourished. I'm not saying it's the case for everyone. I'm saying it's the case for a lot of people, at least most people that I've spoken to and everyone I've worked with so far. I hope this offered some interesting perspective for you guys. I know that this is a controversial topic. I know there are people who may feel like they have a different view of it, have a different opinion of it, different experiences. That's all okay. I just wanted to offer my, view of it as someone who works with this, as someone who researches this, and also someone with lived experience of this, right? Because I see so many people who are undernourished in recovery, who are holding back because they're terrified that their relationship with food is this like monster that needs to be tamed, right? And that this just reinforces further restriction. So I wanted to offer a viewpoint that I hope can be helpful for these people. And so if this is you, I hope you find it helpful. And even if it's not you and you don't agree, I hope at least you could appreciate this perspective as well, right? Please don't neglect the biology of starvation when looking into so binge eating, emotional eating, etc., etc. I think this is too often neglected. Look at what happens in the brain and body when someone is restricting. Look what happens to the metabolism, what happens to the hunger, fullness, what happens to levels of certain hormones. And the truth is, when it comes to these things, you can't talk yourself out of it. You need to eat yourself out of it. And regardless, if you are someone who struggles with what feels like food addiction, you feel like you can't control your eating, you just eat and you feel like everything is just out of control, more restriction is not the answer. Okay, guys, hope you enjoy this. And now I'm going to answer a listener question. So the person is asking, do you have any tips on obsessively trying to remember what you've eaten in a day regardless of the calories? I feel like this is the one thing holding me back for true recovery, because I feel like I let myself eat a bunch of food early in the day, that guilt will follow me. I think this is such a good question, and I feel like I say this about every single question I get. This could deserve an episode of itself, right? So if you guys want me to do an episode about, remembering food, always obsessing about, thinking about what you've eaten and just feeling like that information gets stuck in your head, do let me know. I want to give a quick little explanation as to why this happened, and maybe knowing why it happens can be helpful here. So throughout a day, we are exposed to thousands and thousands and thousands of bit of information, right? Most of the information we are exposed to, we filter out. So for example, I went for a walk with my dog this morning, we probably passed a bunch of people and passed a bunch of houses, but for the life of me, if you asked me, how many people did you pass? How many red cars did you see? I wouldn't know, because my brain didn't save that information. If I had just bought a red car, I can promise you I would have noticed how many red cars we passed. You often hear this when someone buys a specific car, they feel like they see that car everywhere. Or if someone is pregnant, they see pregnant people everywhere, right? It's not because the amount of red cars in the neighborhoods go up or the amount of pregnant people go up. It's just because their brain is filtered. It's programmed to filter this information, take this in, because they have essentially been taught or told themselves, or whatever way you see it, that this is important information that they should focus on. So with an eating disorder, the reason why you are remembering everything you ate and you're thinking about this is because essentially with an eating disorder, food becomes this main theme of your life, right? What you eat in becomes this main theme. So naturally, my dog is making noises. She's like moving around. She's chugging down water. Maybe she's water addicted. Maybe she's emotionally drinking. Crystal, are you okay? Yeah, her name is Crystal. Isn't that cute? Did I say that already? Anyways, with your eating disorder, your brain is programmed to save this information because an eating disorder takes over your life. Food takes over your brain, it becomes main focus in the brain. So naturally, this is information that's being saved, right? Very often people think that in order to recover, they must just stop thinking this, right? But actually, it's the other way around. With recovery, gradually, you are building new experiences that has nothing to do with your eating disorder, right? And your brain is being trained to save different pieces of information. So if you ask me in an evening, what did you eat in a day? I probably would struggle a bit to remember. I would have to go back and think, what did I actually eat, because my brain isn't programmed to save this information. Instead, my brain is programmed to save other bits of information that I have, through my life shown that this is the more important thing to focus on. So I think that what's important here is to understand that your brain is programmed to save this piece of information right now, and you can't necessarily do that much about it except keep going in recovery, keep eating, keep trusting that as you are fully recovered, your brain will stop hyper-focusing on food. And naturally, you may catch yourself, I forgot what I ate today. That's lovely. Did I eat that? I can't remember. But this will take time. And also saving that information of what you've eaten has become a habit, right? It's something you do automatically. I had for some time, even though I didn't want to, it's like I just knew what I've eaten in a day because my brain would save that information. It's like kind of like a language, I always use this metaphor of like a language. If you're constantly using a language, you won't forget the language. But if you stop using it, then you'll gradually forget it. Not overnight, it happens over time. For example, I spent some time living in Spain, and Spanish was used around me a lot, and as naturally I started picking up a lot of Spanish, and I could speak some Spanish. As soon as I moved to Norway, my Spanish went out the window because I didn't use it, right? So my brain didn't save Spanish information. It wasn't around me, it wasn't a priority. Didn't use the language, so I started gradually forgetting it. And this also goes with hyper-focusing on what kind of foods you've eaten. It also goes with stuff such as remembering calories of food, right? So I remember I was like a living calculator during my eating disorder. I knew the calories of everything. And in that information I knew for a while after my eating disorder, because it was just stored in my memory. But then gradually I started forgetting it in the same way that I was gradually forgetting my Spanish because I didn't use the information anymore. And this can be a bit like when you're asked not to think of a pink elephant and then you start thinking of a pink elephant. I don't want you to be like, okay, let me just stop thinking about what I've eaten. That is not necessarily possible, but you can observe your thoughts from a distance, be like, oh, interesting, okay, I have those thoughts, and then you can do something else, right? You can observe your thoughts, you can be aware of them without feeling like you need to hyper focus on them and like solve them, right? And ruminate over them. You can be aware like, yeah, my brain is programmed to save this information. Okay, cool, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is that important. It's just what your brain is programmed to focus on, right? So yeah, that was, I guess, a bit of a simplified answer. I know it doesn't completely, solve the issue, but it gives you some perspective and hopefully some reassurance that it is normal and that it will pass. You just have to keep on going with recovery. And essentially your brain will start focusing and caring about other things as well. Okay guys, that was it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, rate the episode on Spotify or iTunes, wherever you're listening to it. Share it with a friend. I love when you guys share it on your story and tag me. That really, really appreciate it, spreading the word. So yeah, thank you for being supporters of this podcast. I really do appreciate that. And I look forward to talking with you guys next week.